There's this thought, right? A thought that has probably crossed your mind at some point. Or, well, at the very least, you have definitely heard someone say it at a dinner party or in a college classroom with just absolute rock solid confidence.
Oh, I know exactly the kind of statement you mean.
Yeah, they lean back and say, well, if I were God, I would have ended slavery and conquest immediately. Just like that. Boom. Problem solved.
Right. And it's a statement that, I mean, it feels so incredibly right to us, doesn't it?
It feels great to say.
It feels clean. It's definitive. When you hear it, your immediate reaction is, well, obviously.
Yeah.
Why didn't that just happen?
Exactly. It feels intuitively obvious to our modern ears. It's this very decisive moral stance. But here's where we're really going to start peeling back the layers today, because we are looking at some fascinating historical analysis that basically points out why this seemingly bulletproof moral statement is actually, well, it's a massive historical anachronism.
The total trick of the mind?
Right, a trick of the mind. Because when we say that, when we imagine ourselves, looking down at the ancient Near East and waving a magic wand to establish universal human rights, we are quietly, invisibly, really importing the entirely completed machinery of modern society into a world that absolutely did not possess it. We are just projecting our current reality backward.
We're projecting like thousands of years of accumulated institutional development onto a society that was essentially just living on the bleeding edge of biological survival.
Yeah.
And so the mission for our conversation today, this whole deep dive, is to explore exactly why ancient societies fundamentally lacked what we would call modern humanitarian institutions. We're going to unpack a concept known as social carrying capacity.
Which is such a brilliant term.
It really is. And honestly, understanding this concept is going to radically shift the way you view the brutal realities of ancient history, the underlying logic behind ancient legal systems, and surprisingly enough, our own moral responsibilities right now in the modern world.
Right, because before we can even begin to judge the ancient world, we have to set the stage properly, don't we? We have to establish the actual baseline reality of the ancient Near East.
We really do.
Like, there was no international law, there were no UN peacekeepers, there were no ankle monitors, there was no modern welfare state, there was no completed humanitarian infrastructure whatsoever. As the analysis we're diving into today bluntly points out, and I love this detail, they did not even have zippers.
No zippers, no buttons, no.
Yeah. The ancient world was not just, modern America wearing sandals.
That is the essential starting point.
Yeah.
It really is. To understand why ancient history was so unimaginably brutal, we first have to actively strip away our modern background assumptions about what a society actually is.
Which is hard to do.
It's incredibly hard. We take so much for granted. We tend to think of a society as this abstract moral entity, like a collection of ideas and values.
Like a philosophy club or something.
Exactly. But a society is actually a highly complex physical and administrative machine.
I want to spend some time on this because the sheer vastness of the infrastructure required to just be a modern society is practically invisible to us until we really stop and look for it.
It's just the water we swim in.
Right. Think about the infrastructure required to simply utter the words, "We will integrate this defeated population." Think about what happens today if a country takes in a massive wave of displaced people. You don't just stand on a podium and declare them integrated.
No, you need an army of administrators.
Yes, you need national police to maintain order. You need refugee agencies to coordinate the logistics. You need identification records. I mean, you have to actually know who these people are, where they came from, and where they are going.
And you need foster systems for unaccompanied minors, which is a massive undertaking on its own.
Oh, absolutely.
You need mass transportation networks to physically move them.
Yeah.
You need industrial surplus food production to feed a sudden influx of thousands of people without, completely starving your own population in the process.
And the medical side, too. You need sanitation grids, antibiotics, medical infrastructure to prevent, a cholera outbreak from wiping out both the refugees and the host city. Sometimes you even need complex de-radicalization programs.
It's staggering when you list it all out like that.
It is. It's it's like being mad at someone in the 1800s for not texting you back.
That is a great analogy.
Right. You can be as angry as you want about their silence, but the technology to do the thing you were demanding literally doesn't exist yet. But in this historical case, we aren't just talking about a lack of microchips or cell towers. We are talking about a total lack of institutional technology.
Precisely. And this leads to a vital distinction we need to make early on in this deep dive: the difference between aspiration and administration.
Okay, let's unpack that.
So a moral truth and a society's actual capacity to embody that truth, they are not identical. They are two very different things. You can believe with all your heart that every human being possesses immense value. You can announce it from the mountaintops.
Write it in the sky.
Right. But recognizing that truth on an institutional level, that takes constitutional courts capable of hearing complex claims. It takes food systems that can actually prevent mass starvation when the harvest inevitably fails. It takes stable laws of citizenship and mechanisms for a property transfer.
Because without all of that, what are you actually doing? If you just announce a moral principle without the infrastructure to support it, it's basically just words in the wind.
Actually, it's worse than words in the wind. Aspiration without administration isn't government. It can actually be a recipe for complete chaos.
How so?
Well, if you look back at an ancient state, say 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and demand that they preserve and absorb every defeated population, you aren't necessarily demanding peace. Without those modern administrative structures, you might actually be demanding famine.
Because there isn't enough food.
Exactly. You might be creating insurgencies, revenge killings, impossibly tangled land claims, massive internal factionalism, and ultimately, you might just be triggering another, even more devastating war. A command that requires non-existent institutions cannot be obeyed just because it sounds righteous to us 3 millennia later.
I want to really sit with this idea of aspiration versus administration because it really shifts the entire framework of how we judge history. Like, I want you, the listener, to just look around at the invisible safety nets you rely on every single day.
The paved roads, the grocery stores.
Yeah, grocery stores stocked with food from across the globe. The emergency services you can summon just by dialing 3 numbers. The legal system that, despite all its flaws, generally enforces contracts and keeps people from just taking your house. Mercy on a national scale is incredibly astronomically expensive.
It is.
It requires a massive administrative apparatus. And without that apparatus, a moral demand doesn't magically fix anything.
It doesn't. And that, right there, is the hard edge of ancient kingship. When we imagine ancient rulers, we often project our own modern executive branch onto them. We imagine a president with this massive, competent bureaucracy at their fingertips.
Like they have a situation room with glowing screens.
Exactly. But ancient rulers didn't have this machinery. So what did they actually face when the dust settled and the battle ended?
This is where the analysis gets really confronting, I think. Because there is a haunting question here, one that modern critics of ancient history tend to completely gloss over. You win the battle. The enemy is defeated. The question is, spared into what?
Spared into what? Yes.
If an ancient king decides, okay, I will be merciful, I will spare this entirely defeated population, what happens the very next morning? Who feeds them? Who settles their land claims? Who disarms them?
Think about the logistics of just the disarmament alone. It's a nightmare. How do you ensure that the people you just spared don't pick up hidden weapons the moment you turn your back?
Right, because there's no metal detectors, there's no biometric tracking.
None of that. And who prevents their former military and religious authorities from quietly reorganizing in the shadows? Who protects the defeated population from revenge killings by your own citizens, who probably just lost sons and brothers in the fighting? And conversely, who protects your existing population from the inevitable retaliation of the people you just conquered?
And what happens when the winter comes? What happens when the harvests fail? You have just literally doubled the population of your agrarian subsistence level society overnight. You barely had enough grain in the storehouses to feed your own people.
That is the crux of the ruler's burden. A ruler's responsibility isn't just to the defeated enemy standing before them in that single dramatic moment of surrender. A ruler bears the profound existential responsibility for the future survival of their own community, the people entrusted to them.
Their own families, their own farmers.
Exactly. If a king exercises mercy toward an enemy group, but does so without the economic and administrative capacity to sustain both populations, that mercy will foreseeably destroy their own group. They will literally starve to death.
Okay, I have to pause here because I feel a lot of friction with this idea, and I imagine anyone listening does too. Let's grapple with this for a second.
Sure, it's a tough concept.
Isn't biological life always preferable? I mean, to our modern sensibilities, shouldn't we just default to keeping people alive, regardless of the logistical cost? The idea of killing people because it's logistically difficult to keep them alive? I mean, that sounds like a justification for atrocities. Shouldn't the phrase, put them out of their misery be seen as incredibly morally dangerous?
It is incredibly morally dangerous. And it's very important to clarify right now that the historical analysis we are discussing does not excuse wholesale slaughter. It explicitly notes that death is not presumptively merciful.
Okay, good.
A ruler does not get a blank check to just look at a population and decide, well, you're going to starve anyway, so you're better off dead. Substituting the killer's judgment for the victim's will, deciding for them that death is better than suffering, is a catastrophic moral failure.
Right, you can't just preemptively execute people under the guise of doing them a favor. That is the logic of a psychopath.
Exactly. So we are not saying death is a mercy,
Right.
but what we are saying, what the sources are pointing out, is that keeping people alive without the carrying capacity to actually support them, without land, without household protection, without food, without legal standing, merely relocates or prolongs their suffering.
Because if you spare them, but you have no infrastructure to integrate them, what is the actual reality of their daily lives?
The reality is starvation. The reality is permanent displacement and death from exposure to the elements. Or, very likely, the reality is that they are spared into slavery under a different third-party power that sweeps in while your society is weak and overburdened. The harsh truth is that preservation without the capacity to support it can fracture and destroy both the preserved society and the preserving society. You simply cannot require an ancient agrarian kingdom to absorb limitless populations as though food and social order are infinite resources. They weren't. These societies were dealing with absolute, terrifying daily scarcity.
I'm really trying to visualize this. It's not like a modern nation taking in refugees, where you set up UN camps, fly in supplies on cargo planes, and eventually process them into the workforce. If an ancient king spares 10,000 people, there is no FEMA. There are no supply drops.
Just dirt and empty fields.
Yeah, there's just a crowd of hungry, angry, traumatized people standing in a field, and a city behind you whose granaries are already half empty.
And that leads to the next inevitable question a modern mind asks when looking at this. Okay, maybe you can't build a massive organized refugee camp, but why not just let them disperse? Why not just absorb the defeated people as regular individual civilians? Just let them move into the towns, find a trade, get a job, and blend in.
Right, the assimilation model. Just let them become part of the melting pot.
But that idea brings us face to face with a massive foundational psychological and legal difference between the ancient world and the modern world. When you say let them get a job and blend in, you are assuming the existence of the modern individual.
What do you mean by that? How is the modern individual different?
In our modern liberal order, we view people primarily as autonomous, free-floating individuals. You are you. You have a social security number, a passport, a resume. We have strict, formal legal distinctions between civilians and combatants.
Right.
Your citizenship, your employment, your religious beliefs, your family descent, these are all separate, neatly categorized legal boxes. You can change your job without changing your religion. You can move to a new city without asking your extended family for permission.
If my brother commits a bank robbery, the police don't show up at my house to arrest me. We are legally separate entities. My identity is not his identity.
Exactly. But you cannot project that framework backward. In the ancient world, identity was intensely, inescapably corporate. You were not an autonomous individual making your way in the world. You belonged to a household, a lineage, a clan, a cult, a specific piece of ancestral land, and a political community.
It was all tied together.
Inseparable. Your membership in your household determined everything about your life. It determined your labor, your inheritance, who you married, your physical protection, and your social obligations.
So there was no concept of just being a private citizen who minds their own business.
None. And this corporate nature of identity completely changes the nature of warfare. Ancient warfare was rarely just a clash between professional soldiers who were detached from civilian society. It was whole communities clashing. It was one corporate body attempting to subjugate or destroy another corporate body.
This connects to what the analysis calls the Trojan horse concern, doesn't it? Because if identity is corporate, if you are inextricably bound to your clan and your nation, then what happens when your army loses a battle?
Right. When an ancient army was defeated in the field, the nation they belonged to didn't just vanish into thin air. The political entity, the grievances, the territorial claims, they survived. They continued through the surviving families, through the inherited memories passed down by the elders, through the shared language, and through the lingering religious ties to the land.
It's not like a modern corporate merger. When Company A buys Company B, the employees from Company B might be annoyed, but they generally just shrug, put on a new lanyard, and go back to typing spreadsheets.
Right. They don't start a guerrilla war in the break room.
Exactly. They don't swear a blood oath to overthrow the new CEO in 20 years. But in the ancient world, it was more like a multi-generational blood feud. The threat to the conquering king isn't just the physical sword held in a soldier's hand on the day of the battle. The threat is the entire social body of the defeated nation reconstituting itself tomorrow, or 10 years from now, or 50 years from now.
The future of a defeated nation existed entirely within the people who remained alive. Now, the historical analysis is careful to point out that this doesn't mean every single infant was consciously plotting a rebellion in their crib, or that every elderly person was secretly sharpening a sword in the middle of the night. That would be an absurd caricature.
But the structural threat was real.
The structural threat was undeniable. The defeated political society could, and historically often would, continue corporately through people who were, on an individual level, non-combatants. Children grow up.
Yeah, they do.
They mature into claimants to the land, into avengers of their fathers' deaths, into restorers of the former political order. Elders preserve the history, the grievances, the royal lineages, the political legitimacy. So a conquered population wasn't just a temporary humanitarian need. It was an ongoing existential political problem for the conqueror.
So, if you are an ancient ruler, you are facing a hostile corporate body that wants its land back, and you have absolutely none of the modern tools of integration. You have no national police force to monitor them, no public school system to assimilate their children, no booming industrial economy to give them a stake in your society. What tools did you have?
The tools they actually possessed were incredibly grim. We have historical records of how ancient conquerors managed this corporate threat. Let's look at the Neo-Assyrian Empire, for example, which was one of the dominant superpowers of the ancient Near East.
Okay.
When they conquered a territory, they didn't have the capacity for peaceful integration, so they used a brutal toolkit.
What did that toolkit look like? Because I imagine it wasn't pretty.
It was terrifying. They used forced mass migration. They would literally uproot entire populations and deport them to the opposite end of the empire. The logic was to sever the corporate body from its ancestral land and its local cult shrines, thereby breaking its political cohesion.
That is horrifying. I mean, the logistics of marching tens of thousands of people across deserts. The death toll must have been astronomical.
It was. Alongside deportation, they used heavy punitive tribute. They would strip a conquered region of its wealth, its grain, and its livestock to ensure the subjugated people remained too weak to ever rebel. They used mass enslavement. They forced assimilation by scattering conquered peoples among loyal populations.
Just breaking them apart entirely.
Yes. And quite often, they engaged in the targeted, violent destruction of the defeated political elites, executing the royal families, the priests, the military leaders, to permanently decapitate the society.
It's an absolute nightmare. The analysis calls this the narrow way, right?
Yes, the narrow way. But there's a crucial nuance here that we really must acknowledge. Pointing out that they had a narrow, severe set of mechanisms does not mean that total extermination was the only option available to them.
Right.
We see ancient states using other methods. Tribute systems, making states into vassals, taking royal children as hostages to ensure good behavior, establishing diplomatic intermarriage.
So we can't just throw up our hands and say every single historical massacre was an absolute, unavoidable necessity.
Exactly. Necessity has to be historically demonstrated, not just lazily asserted to excuse atrocities. However, the overarching truth remains. Because they lack the capacity for modern reconciliation and structural integration, their methods for neutralizing a defeated power were inherently, inescapably coercive and violent.
That was just the air they breathed.
Okay, so this paints a deeply disturbing picture. The absolute baseline of the ancient world is corporate warfare, mass slavery, forced deportation, and violent subjugation. This is the water everyone is swimming in. Which brings us to a massive question that anyone who has ever cracked open a Bible has probably wrestled with.
Oh, definitely.
How do we explain biblical laws? Because if you read the Old Testament, you see laws that seem to actively participate in these brutal systems. There are laws regarding slavery. There are laws regarding warfare and taking captives. Does God just endorse the Bronze Age? Does the biblical text just shrug and say, well, that's how it's done? This is where the historical and theological analysis we are looking at becomes incredibly profound. First, it requires us to establish a wider historical context. God did not encounter a pristine, blank civilization and suddenly decide to invent domination, and slavery.
Right, it wasn't a clean slate.
Not at all. Slavery, conquest, forced labor, mass violence, these institutions existed across countless civilizations long, long before biblical Israel emerged.
They weren't uniquely Israelite.
No, they were a global human reality born of deep scarcity and perpetual war. They existed in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in the Americas.
And the analysis actually makes a very sharp point here about the Atlantic slave trade, doesn't it? Just to maintain historical honesty and prevent false equivalencies, which I think is really important.
It does, and it's a crucial distinction. The text notes that while slavery existed everywhere in the ancient world, European empires and the Atlantic system later racialized slavery in a uniquely durable and massive way. They joined African ancestry to hereditary chattel status on a global industrial scale.
Yeah, which was historically unprecedented.
Exactly. So, historical honesty requires us to reject two myths simultaneously. Europeans didn't invent the concept of slavery, but their participation was absolutely not incidental or morally insignificant. They built an enormous, devastating commercial system around it that had deeply unique characteristics.
Right. Okay, so going back to the ancient Near East, we have a world already deeply structured by patriarchy, war, debt servitude, and violent competition. And the analysis uses a really interesting New Testament example to explain how biblical law interacts with that pre-existing reality. It brings up the moment when Jesus is asked by religious leaders about the law of divorce.
Yeah, that's a perfect parallel.
When Jesus is asked why Moses permitted divorce in the Torah, he doesn't say, because divorce is the perfect, ideal, untarnished design for humanity. He says Moses permitted it because of the hardness of human hearts.
Yes, the law was making a concession to a broken, hardened reality.
And I'm reading this and thinking, okay, how does this principle apply to the laws about ancient warfare and slavery? If the laws aren't presenting the moral ideal, what are they actually doing?
They are doing what the analysis calls the distinction between regulation and origination. This concept is vital for understanding ancient texts. A law may govern and regulate a hardened, brutal social reality without declaring that reality to be the ultimate moral ideals.
Okay, regulation, not origination.
Right. God enters a human world already defined by the sword. The biblical laws, therefore, often regulate practices they do not originate.
So permission is not perfection.
Exactly. Permission is not perfection. It is management of a deeply flawed system. So it's about placing boundaries in the Bronze Age. The Torah contains severe laws that accurately reflect that hard world, but it also establishes unprecedented restraints on that severity. It doesn't abolish the ancient order in one magical stroke because, as we discussed, the society utterly lacked the carrying capacity, the administrative hardware, to survive such an abolition, but it places strict boundaries within it.
I want to get into some specific examples of this because seeing how these laws actually functioned on the ground really, it grounds this abstract idea for me.
Right.
Let's talk about the laws protecting a captive woman in war.
That is a perfect example of this regulation. In the broader ancient world, if a city was conquered, a captive woman was considered immediate disposable property. She was just the spoils of war.
It's just an
But biblical law intervenes in that universally accepted practice. It forces a delay in possession. It requires the captor to allow her a full month to mourn her parents and her former life. She shaves her head, takes off her captive clothes. It mandates that she must be brought into his house and treated as a wife, not merely used and discarded.
And crucially, it prohibits selling her or re-enslaving her if that relationship ends.
Yes, if the captor is displeased with her, he must let her go free. He cannot treat her as merchandise. Now, does this turn ancient war captivity into a modern 21st century standard of egalitarian consent?
Obviously not.
Of course not. It is still a deeply uncomfortable reality to modern readers. But historically, it imposes profound limits inside a brutal institution that already existed everywhere else without any limits whatsoever. It acknowledges her humanity and her grief in a world that usually ignored both.
Another fascinating example the analysis brings up is the siege laws in Deuteronomy. When an army is besieging a city, the law specifically prohibits chopping down fruit-bearing trees just for military expediency or to build siege works.
Right, which seems like a small thing, but it's massive.
Why? Because you have to preserve the resources needed for life after the battle is over. In a subsistence economy, chopping down an orchard isn't just an environmental crime. It is essentially a long-term death sentence for the entire region. It ensures that whoever survives the siege will starve in the coming years.
And we see this regulatory boundary continually in protections for the most vulnerable classes of that era. The resident aliens, the widows, the orphans.
Yeah, the gleaning laws.
Yes, the law constantly commands the Israelites to leave the gleanings of their fields for the poor, to remember that they were once slaves in Egypt, and to treat the foreigner with justice. The analysis points out that this is exactly what developmental government looks like. You don't pretend that people have already arrived at moral perfection.
You work with what you have.
Right. But you prevent the existing brutal system from operating without limit, all while planting principles, seeds of justice, that will eventually grow to exceed and dismantle that very system.
Okay, so this brings up the next massive question for me. If biblical laws were just planting the seeds or setting the boundaries of a better system, how do we actually get from the Bronze Age to the modern world? How do we get to a place where a society can look at slavery and say, we are abolishing this completely? The text introduces a concept here that I think is the key to the entire discussion: social carrying capacity.
This is the hinge of the entire argument. Social carrying capacity is essentially the structural strength of a civilization. It is the amount of complexity, number of competing claims, and the diversity of identities that a society can peacefully absorb without collapsing into civil war or chaos. And that capacity is not static. It changes throughout history.
So small, ancient agrarian kingdoms had incredibly low capacity.
Very low.
Yeah.
They couldn't handle much diversity or internal friction without splintering. But modern industrialized states have vastly greater capacity. They have the administrative hardware to manage immense complexity.
And the analysis uses American history as a really profound illustration of how a society actually goes about expanding this capacity over time. It's not an overnight process.
Far from it. It's agonizing. Think about the founding of the United States. Think about the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That is a massive, absolute, world-changing moral declaration.
Nearly as.
It was announced right at the beginning. But did the society that announced it actually have the institutional capacity or the political will to embody it?
No, not even close. Black people were incorporated primarily as coerced labor, entirely denied full civic membership.
So you have the aspiration, but you completely lack the administration. You have the moral truth announced, but the society cannot yet carry it. It took the agonizing, bloody crucible of the Civil War to pass the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in 1865. Then came the 14th Amendment in 1868, establishing birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. Then the 15th Amendment in 1870, guaranteeing voting rights.
But, and this is where the history gets really dark and really relevant for our conversation, even those formal constitutional developments didn't instantly produce a society of complete civic incorporation. The parchment was signed, but the reality on the ground didn't magically change.
Because the social carrying capacity, the public culture, the local enforcement mechanisms, the willingness of the populace to abide by the new rules hadn't fully caught up to the constitutional amendment.
Right, because almost immediately after the Reconstruction era ends, when the federal troops are withdrawn from the South in 1877, you see states throwing up a massive architecture of resistance.
A total backlash.
Yeah, you see poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. You see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan acting as a terroristic shadow police force to enforce white supremacy. You see the institutionalization of Jim Crow segregation. All these barriers were erected specifically to restrict that newly declared citizenship.
It took almost another entire century of relentless, grinding struggle, of organizing, of marching, of litigation, of resistance to finally get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And those acts were necessary because they finally built the federal enforcement mechanisms, the legal infrastructure, to actually protect those rights on a granular, everyday level.
I keep coming back to the analogy of upgrading a computer. It's like trying to run a brand new, highly sophisticated operating system on a computer built in 1995. You can have the software, the moral idea of equality, the Declaration of Independence, but the hardware isn't built yet if you don't have the courts, the federal marshals, the specific enforcement agencies, the public culture to actually run it. The system just crashes. Or, as in the Jim Crow era, the local hardware violently refuses to run the program.
And the historical analysis makes a point here that we really must not gloss over. This hardware wasn't just benevolently handed down by a static, generous system.
No, it was fought for.
Yes, African Americans, abolitionists, civil rights activists, they actively fought, bled, and died to force the society to build that hardware. The moral awakening was forced into enforceable state law through profound, sustained struggle.
So the broader developmental principle here is that American history shows us the agonizing difference between a society possessing an abstract moral declaration and a society gradually, painfully constructing the law, the enforcement, the economy, and the public culture required to actually embody it. It takes time, it takes institutions, and it takes friction.
Yes. But while a society is trying to expand its capacity, while it's going through these massive, often violent growing pains, it still has to survive. The state still has to maintain basic order. It still has to protect what the analysis calls the body politic from internal threats that might tear it apart before it can grow into its full potential.
And this brings us to a part of the discussion that is incredibly sensitive, but very necessary. The text uses a biological analogy to describe internal threats to a society, but it comes with a massive, flashing warning sign.
It does. It uses the analogy of the body politic and cancer.
Okay.
The idea is that a multicultural nation is like a biological body. It relies on common systems to survive, common law, a shared language of commerce, reciprocal obligations between citizens. And just like a biological body, a political order can develop internal forces that act cancerously. Forces that consume common resources, evade lawful correction, reject reciprocal obligation, and attack the very system that sustains them.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back strongly
Yeah.
because I'm listening to this and my alarm bells are ringing.
That's completely understandable.
Comparing a group of people within your society to a cancer, I mean, that is historically terrifying. That is the exact rhetoric that almost always precedes atrocities. It's the language of ethnic cleansing. It's the language of the Rwandan genocide, of the Holocaust. Calling people a disease is how you justify excising them.
You are absolutely right to push back on that, and your alarm bells should be ringing. And the author of the analysis completely agrees with you. In fact, the text uses that exact historical fear to draw a hard, unforgiving line between two radically different ways of thinking about internal threats. Exterminative logic versus diagnostic precision. Okay, let's unpack that carefully. What is the difference between exterminative logic and diagnostic precision? The source explicitly and forcefully rejects any racial or identity-based diagnoses. It states clearly that saying something like people of color are a cancer or immigrants are a disease is not a sound body politic diagnosis. It is exterminative logic.
Because it's based on identity.
Exactly. Because it identifies a presumed pathology based purely on ancestry or identity before demonstrating any malignant operation. It treats the mere existence and reproduction of a people as a danger. And history shows us exactly what happens next. Once you label a people as malignant tissue, destruction begins to look like a medical cure.
So if the text rejects labeling people that way, how does it actually use the cancer analogy without falling into that trap?
It demands diagnostic precision based strictly on operations. Think about how cancer is defined biologically. Cancer isn't defined by its color or its origin or its identity. It's defined entirely by what it does.
Right, by its behavior.
Yes. It is defined by uncontrolled growth, by the evasion of regulatory signals, by the destruction of surrounding tissue. Therefore, in a political body, a movement or an institution only acts cancerously based on its functional operations.
Give me a concrete example of a cancerous operation in a political body.
The text lists several criteria. And remember, it doesn't matter if it's a white movement, a black movement, an indigenous movement, a political party, a religious group, or even a massive corporation. The identity is completely irrelevant. What matters is the action.
The operation.
Right. If a movement requires permanent hostility and polarization to preserve its power.
Yeah.
If it assigns collective guilt to citizens based solely on their ancestry. If it demands unequal rules like the law applies to you but not to us. If it captures public institutions merely to reproduce its own grievances, or if it treats societal reconciliation as a threat to its existence, that is a cancerous operation.
So the absolute takeaway here, and we need to be crystal clear on this, you judge the threat to the body politic entirely by what an institution or a movement does, never by who the people are. The people are never the cancer because of their identity.
Yeah.
An institution or a movement can act cancerously because of its actions.
Exactly. Identity is not pathology. Operation is pathology, as the text states. That distinction is not softness. It is diagnostic precision. You have to be able to identify political decay without resorting to the exterminative logic of blaming an entire demographic group.
That is a crucial distinction. Okay, let's pull the lens all the way back and bring this back to the grand theological sweep of the analysis we've been discussing today.
Let's do it.
If simply dropping a perfect modern egalitarian system onto an ancient society doesn't work, if they lack the carrying capacity and the hardware to run the software, what is the ultimate goal? What is the theological narrative here? What is God doing in this long, agonizing historical process?
The text argues powerfully against the idea of God operating what it calls an alien moral machine.
Hmm.
I want you to really visualize this for a second. Imagine if God just miraculously installed a fully modern 21st century humanitarian infrastructure all around ancient Israel. Angels drop down out of the sky and build constitutional courts, refrigerated supply chains, federal prisons, and UN peacekeeping headquarters.
Yeah.
And God just operates this perfect machinery from heaven.
The machinery itself would be perfectly righteous, obviously. There would be no starvation, no brutal warfare.
Right. But what about the people inside it? The people would remain completely unchanged. Their inner social understanding, their values, their instincts would still be firmly rooted in the Bronze Age.
They'd still want blood revenge.
Exactly. They wouldn't understand why they shouldn't exact blood revenge. They wouldn't understand why all humans have equal value. They would just be prevented from acting on their instincts by an overwhelming alien force.
They would just be cardboard figures inhabiting a theological laboratory. They wouldn't be moral agents. They'd just be caged by a system they didn't comprehend at all.
Precisely. A cage, no matter how benevolently designed, does not create a righteous person. And this brings the author to the book of Jeremiah, specifically Jeremiah chapter 31, which is presented as the theological culmination of this entire developmental process.
Okay, what does Jeremiah say?
Jeremiah 31 contains the famous promise of a new covenant, but the key is how that covenant is described. The promise is that the law will no longer just be written on stone tablets, which are external commands, rules imposed from the outside, but the law will be written within the people, upon their hearts.
Okay. This connects directly to the title of the essay we are referencing, The Personable Government of God.
Yes, personable versus mechanical. God's government is personable because he meets humanity exactly where it is. He meets them in their infancy, amidst their crushing scarcity, their brutal violence, their deep tribalism. But, and this is the vital key, he meets them there without declaring that they must remain there forever. The movement of God's government is not a top-down imposition of an alien machine. The movement is inward.
So it's about internal formation, not just external imposition. It's about growing a capacity, not just dictating a result.
Exactly. A person or a nation becomes righteous by coming to love and understand the good. They have to wrestle with it, fail at it, build institutions for it, and internalize it. They do not become righteous merely by being physically forced into behavior they don't comprehend.
Right.
You don't drop the completed perfect kingdom onto an ancient people and call the alien machinery their righteousness. You write the law into the people, slowly, over generations, so the people themselves can carry the kingdom.
I am genuinely marveling at this concept because it means God governs history by walking this incredibly difficult, almost agonizing middle ground.
It is an agonizing middle ground.
On one hand, he restrains the worst violence of the ancient world through regulatory laws without pretending that the violence has magically vanished. And on the other hand, he plants moral principles like protecting the captive, leaving grain for the poor, demanding equal justice for the foreigner that will take centuries, millennia of human struggle and institutional development to fully bloom.
It is a profound and deeply patient way to view the arc of history. God does not confuse infancy with adulthood. He doesn't condemn the infant for lacking the completed capacities of the adult. He doesn't expect a Bronze Age society to act like a 21st century democracy. But he also doesn't declare that infancy is the final ideal form of humanity. He guides the growth.
This brings us to a really powerful conclusion, I think, because this entire developmental argument we've been tracking is a sharp double-edged sword, and we really need to look closely at both edges before we finish up here.
It absolutely is a double-edged sword. One edge of the sword protects ancient societies from our dishonest, anachronistic projections.
Right.
It forces us to put down our modern arrogance. It makes us realize that sitting in our air-conditioned homes and condemning ancient rulers for failing to use administrative institutions that literally did not exist is not a sign of moral enlightenment. It's just historical fantasy.
It's judging a fish for not knowing how to ride a bicycle. They couldn't do it. But the other edge of the sword, the other edge swings right back at us. Because this developmental argument completely removes ancient necessity as an excuse for modern cruelty.
Exactly. The logic here is inescapable. If capacity determines responsibility, then greater capacity creates greater responsibility.
We sitting here today do possess modern courts. We have industrial food systems that produce massive surpluses. We have international law, mass communications, diplomatic channels, reconstruction capabilities. We have an institutional carrying capacity that ancient Israel or Assyria or Rome could only dream of.
You need the hardware.
We have the hardware. Therefore, we have absolutely no excuse whatsoever to imitate Bronze Age brutality while claiming it's some sort of tragic necessity. We cannot backpedal modern America into ancient Israel. We can't say, well, they wiped out their enemies in the Bible, so we can too.
The moral truths, the inherent value of human life, the demands of justice haven't changed. But our capacity to embody those truths has vastly expanded over thousands of years, which means our obligation to embody them has vastly expanded as well. We are no longer infants. We are expected to use the hardware we have built.
Which leaves me with a lingering thought for you, the listener. Something to mull over long after this conversation ends. We look back at the ancient world, and it is so easy to judge them for what they lacked, until we realize they didn't have the institutional hardware to act any differently. It took thousands of years of agonizing human struggle to build the carrying capacity that allows us to practice our modern version of mercy. So the provocative question is this: what future moral truths are we currently failing to embody simply because we haven't yet built the institutions to carry them? What invisible structures of mercy are we entirely blind to today? And what will a listener 1,000 years from now, looking back at the 21st century, judge us for lacking?